Okay, so for the next of our mini lectures for prevention, we're going to be talking about prevention programs in schools. We'll move through 5 different categories: the knowledge, attitudes, and behavior model, effective education, anti-drug norms, the social influence model, and then finally we're going to spend some time talking about DARE, that very popular program that many of us know about. So an important thing to think about as we move through these prevention programs is this idea that they're all focused on schools. And it's an interesting question because if we think about drug dependence, we know that all dependence doesn't really start in youth. And if we're talking about truly effective prevention, it should be available for people at all ages and stages of life. But if we think about drug use and that conflict between the drug-free society that we're supposedly striving for and the true behavior patterns that many of us exhibit, it tends to be a lot more comfortable to talk about preventing drug use in children. It's got to be safe for the kids. It's a vulnerable population. We're pretty clear that setting boundaries for children and drug use is something that we're comfortable with, even though it may not apply to ourselves. So think about that, what a truly effective drug abuse prevention program would look like and whether it would truly focus on children this young. We'll talk about a couple of programs and they kind of move forward in historical order. So one of the first models that we used when we talked about drug abuse prevention in children was this knowledge, attitudes, and behavior model. So this was kind of that scared straight approach where a school would bring in maybe a police officer, a former drug use, a corrections officer, or somebody like a pharmacologist who knew a lot about the effects of the drugs, and they would try to scare the children in the school setting into not using drugs. So we talked earlier about the assumptions behind the approach. What are we assuming this will do? And the assumption behind this one was that by increasing student knowledge, and by that would stop their behavior of using drugs by them realizing what the consequences would be that they would not make that choice. And that if we could change their attitudes about drug use, then their changed attitudes would also keep them from using drugs. So if you think about maybe some choices in your own life, think about maybe whether or not you're wearing sunscreen today. Chances are that you know that skin cancer is a risk for us, particularly those of us who live in the Las Vegas Valley. And you know that you should wear sunscreen to protect yourself from that risk. But are you doing that? So the reason I ask that question is because one of the things that we've learned in public health over the past couple of decades is that people don't really make rational choices about their health a lot of the time. So when we talk about increasing student knowledge about the dangerous side effects of drugs, we find that really having knowledge about drugs' consequences is not an effective tool to discourage children from using them, for a lot of the reasons that it doesn't work with adults as well. So in the 1970s, this traditional approach that we've been using in schools really began to be questioned about whether it was accomplishing what it was set out to do, whether it was reaching those goals that had been set to decrease drug use. And actually, as researchers started to answer the question, they found that it might actually be doing the opposite, that the more knowledge students had about drugs, the more positive their attitudes tended to be about drug use. So what they found was that rather than keeping students from using drugs or abusing drugs, they were actually increasing knowledge about drugs, but not really changing attitudes or behaviors. So this wasn't exactly the desired outcome. And people became concerned that what they were actually doing with those scared straight type knowledge, attitudes, and behavior programs was teaching students about drugs that they might not have heard about otherwise. So keep in mind, as human beings, we tend not to make rational decisions about things involving our health. They tend to be affected by many other things, and that that goal of the drug-free society was not something that these programs were effectively accomplishing. So moving on from that model, many drug abuse programs or drug abuse prevention programs came to be focused around this idea of effective education. So notice this is an A, not an E. Effective education is something that works well. Effective education, when we talk about affect in psychology and substance abuse research, we're talking about things that have to do with emotions and attitudes. And if we think about some of the things that we've discussed about students with self-esteem issues, with anger management issues, students who engage in risky behaviors, being more likely to become substance abusers, it seems like we might be getting a little bit closer to the root of the issue. So some examples of how affective education would be focused. We might have students who are using drugs for excitement or relaxation. I have students who've been in this class before who talked about growing up in a small town where drinking on the weekend was really the only social outlet that was available. So that idea of excitement, or people who are very highly stressed and they find that substance use helps them to relax. So lots of different reasons why drug use can affect our affective state or our emotions and attitudes. So the idea here was that if we could help children to be more emotionally literate, to know and express their feelings, and how to change their emotions, how to become happier, how to become more relaxed, how to find things that excited them without drugs, that we may actually be able to decrease substance abuse rates by helping children to feel valued and accepted. Maybe we could address some of those risky behavior or anger management issues that may be associated with drug abuse in later life. So when we looked at how that broke down in affective education, the main concepts that were addressed were values clarification, alternatives to drugs, and personal and social skills. So values clarification, here we're talking about helping students to become more emotionally literate, recognize their feelings, express their beliefs, things that are important to them. And we're assuming that students already have that factual information about the drugs. We don't need to tell them what marijuana is, they already know. And also that these decision-making skills that they would need would not be focused specifically on drugs, but they'd be more kind of general decision-making skills that related to life skills. So one of the other focuses of this program was providing alternatives to drugs. And there was this assumption, like the high school students in a small town, that taking drugs might be experiential, that it doesn't necessarily have to do with the substance itself. So they started to look for and propose alternative non-drug activities, that connection with a natural high, things like sports activities, emotional connection, that sort of thing. And then finally, personal and social skills. So the assumption here is that the student is using drugs because there's some kind of personal or social network failure around them. So by increasing students' abilities to connect with others, to communicate, and providing successful experiences for that student, that they would feel more secure, higher self-esteem, less likely to engage in substance abuse. So this last category, this is something that we still see. We call it social capital now, the idea of a student having a supportive and engaged community around them. And we do continue to find that students with higher social capital scores are less likely to become substance abusers. So some of this continues. So this was kind of if you can kind of pick out the emphasis on emotions and connections and self-esteem, we saw a lot of these programs becoming popular in the 1970s, along with lots of other trends in drug use, which you're probably familiar with. And then we reached the 1980s, and we started to see in many categories of American society this shift towards more conservative cultural positions, and possibly in response to some of the excesses of the 70s, particularly when we talk about drug use and abuse. So this is when we started to see that just say no approach that you've probably heard before. Just say no. If you've never seen some of the original pieces associated with that campaign, I've got a couple here for you to watch. Bear with me just a second.
It's a big pack for you.
No.
Cocaine?
No thanks.
Yo, my man, you want some lewds?
No way. If someone offers you drugs, instead of saying something you really don't mean, just say, no.
Got some $6 for you. No.
No. No big production number. Just say, no. You'd be surprised how well it works. No.
All right. So those were some of the campaigns that were airing on TV at that time. And then we also had some true cultural gems like this one.
Makes the team look good, but there's a hook we gotta shake from the neighborhood. My name is West, and on the court I'm rough. Out here on the street, we all gotta get tough. Say no to drugs, on the drug man's blood.
You call me strength, give my team my best. When you really care, you can do no less. But the game of life is more serious, cause drugs make fools of all of us.
My name is Michael, but they call me Cool. My main hangout is up around the hoop. We play hard, but we still play smart. We never let drugs tear us apart.
child the way to go. And when the drug man comes, he'll say no. Just say no. Just say no to drugs. Just
All right.
say no. Just say
I'm going to spare you any more bad rap from men in short shorts. But an interesting thing to keep in mind here is that whole just say no to drugs. When we think about some of the behaviors that we might have expected from professional basketball players, sports celebrities, and really many adults in the lives of these children, and telling them just say no to drugs while we continue to consume them on our own, kids definitely are aware of these kinds of conflicts. So, interesting cultural artifact maybe, but possibly not our best approach to preventing drug abuse in children in schools. So this is that conservative cultural shift in response to some of the drug excesses of the 70s, that just say no approach. All drugs are bad. Although we're going to continue to use them as adults, we're just going to tell kids not to do it. That's not a horribly effective approach. But it was an important reflection of these new anti-drug norms, that this whole cultural shift away from drug use being an acceptable part of society. In 1984, we saw one of the first important reviews from a research perspective of drug prevention programs. And that's when we noticed that many programs that were funded at high levels didn't really evaluate whether or not they were accomplishing their goals. Again, we reinforced that idea that increasing knowledge about drugs, that scared straight approach about all the things that cocaine can do to you, or the horrible effects of marijuana, and we presented in 8th grade, really had no effect on whether or not children eventually became substance users or abusers. And then that next step, that affective education, it placed too little emphasis on the skills necessary to really resist pressure for drugs. A lot of the programs that we saw coming out of that affective education model, very self-esteem focused, which is wonderful, but not necessarily focused on drug refusal skills. And again, not really having that degree of success we'd like to see for the amount of money that we were investing in it. So coming out of this, we saw two new approaches develop in this context of the context of this cultural conservative shift, and then also the sense that things that we were doing really weren't working. The first one was to really start to focus in on those refusal skills, and then the second was to try to develop this concept of drug-free schools. So really focusing in on that school environment. So looking at those, just those refusal skills, this is that just say no approach. Now, if we think about the media piece that we just saw, there's not a lot of refusal skill training going on. If we think about that last clip with the young African-American boy walking through his neighborhood carrying a basketball, car pulls up, somebody's offering him some kind of drug, I don't remember what it was, and we've got this young, maybe elementary or early middle school age kid saying, just say no. Now, of course, if we back the camera up, we know there's an awful lot more going on in that student's life than just that particular 5-second clip. But the true refusal skill programs really did have a broader focus. Maybe not the 30-second television commercial, but refusal skills talked a lot more about that whole concept of peer pressure and how to resist. So we knew it was effective with discouraging children from smoking. So there was some questions about whether we could use that effective approach to help to decrease substance abuse, use and abuse in children. And then that whole idea of drug-free schools. In 1986, we saw the federal government begin to provide direct aid for drug prevention, so direct federal funding for these programs. And they were for school policies that were meant to really reinforce that the school didn't promote drug use, promote or condone. I'm sorry, promote's the wrong word, but really didn't condone drug use. This is when we started to see locker searches, when we started to see even teachers not being allowed to smoke on school grounds. So this real approach that schools as a geographic location were going to be a drug-free zone in our society. So we've looked at the first couple of our school-based programs. I'll wrap up the lecture here for now, and the next one we'll be talking about the social influence model and then the very popular program we know as DARE.